I was eating a sandwich when they called me. Not a communication request, not a priority flag, a physical summons. A Thesari audit clerk walked the length of the fabrication bay floor, stood beside my lunch crate, and said my name in that precise way they say everything. Consonants filed to the micrometer, no inflection, no opinion. Havden Jesper, General Labor Contract, Badge 7140. Your presence is required at Press Bay 4. I wrapped the sandwich in its cloth, tucked it into the crate, and followed him across the floor. The Thesari Fabrication Compact ran the largest precision manufacturing operation in the sector. 26 assembly lines, 900 catalogued alloy types in their material index, tolerances measured to the submicron. They made hull panels, coupling assemblies, guidance housings, anything a fleet or a station needed, built to specification, and delivered inside a margin of error so small you'd need their instruments to detect it. They were proud of that margin. It was, as far as I could tell, the only thing the Thesari were proud of. I had worked on Platform Korath for 11 months as general labor. I swept floors, moved crates, degreased machine beds with solvent rags, and once, I was allowed to wipe a press guide rail with a specific grade of polishing cloth under supervision for 12 minutes. The Thesari supervisor timed me. 12 minutes exactly, and then the cloth was collected, weighed, logged for fiber loss, and disposed of according to Regulation TS 417. I asked what happened if the cloth weighed differently than expected. The supervisor said the cloth had never weighed differently than expected. So when the audit clerk told me Press Bay 4 had a problem, and that my advisory input was being formally requested, I assumed somebody had spilled something and wanted a human with a mop. Press Bay 4 was a wide, sunlit hall with clear-story windows running the full length of the east wall. Morning light fell across the floor in pale slabs. The press itself stood at the center of the bay, a 3-story vertical fabrication unit that stamped structural hull panels from raw plate stock. It was, by the Thesari's own published valuation, worth more than every piece of equipment in bays 1 through 3 combined. It was also seized solid. 3 Thesari fabrication engineers stood around the base in their gray coveralls, identical postures, identical expressions, or rather, identical absence of expression. Behind them, a wall-mounted diagnostic board displayed 900 horizontal bars in graduated color, the full alloy index, every material the compact had ever catalogued. Every single bar was green. Every material in their inventory had been tested, cross-referenced, and eliminated as the cause. The senior engineer turned. Havden Jesper. Contractual Advisory Clause 9.4 permits external perspective in unresolved mechanical events. You may inspect. I looked at the press. I looked at the diagnostic board. I looked at the 3 engineers. What's wrong with it? The central guide rail has developed a dimensional inconsistency. The tolerance between the rail and the bearing surface now exceeds the operational envelope by a factor the index does not resolve. It's worn, I said. 3 identical stares. The rail surface has thinned, I said, slower. From use, friction, metal sliding against metal day after day until a little bit of it isn't there anymore. The rail is within its catalogued service life, the senior engineer said. The replacement schedule is not due for 11 cycles. Right, but the metal wore down before the schedule said it should. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd heard on Platform Korath. The Thesari didn't have a word for that, for a material that performed outside its cataloged parameters before its scheduled end of life. Their entire system was built on the certainty that every alloy did exactly what the index said for exactly the duration specified. When a part reached its listed service life, you replaced it whole. You did not repair it. You did not shim it, file it, grind it, or adjust it. You filed a decommission order and requisitioned a new unit from the forge. The decommission order has been prepared, the senior engineer confirmed, as though reading my thoughts. However, The replacement rail requires a fabrication lead time of 41 cycles. During that period, this press will be offline. 41 cycles. I didn't ask what that meant in lost output. The thesauri would have told me in a number so large and so precise that it would have ruined my appetite, and I still had half a sandwich waiting. I walked over to the rail. I crouched and ran my thumb along the bearing surface where it met the press carriage. I could feel the dish, a shallow concavity where the metal had thinned, no wider than my thumbnail, maybe 3/10 of a millimeter deep, maybe less. My thumb knew the answer before any gauge would have, because my thumb wasn't looking it up in an index. You need a shim, I said. Define. A thin piece of metal, filed to fit the gap. You slide it in between the rail and the bearing surface, it takes up the difference, and the press runs. From what alloy? Doesn't matter much, anything that won't deform under the press load. I looked down at my waist. Brass buckle, standard issue, stamped out of a single piece of 70/30 cartridge brass by some factory on Earth that probably didn't exist anymore. Tough enough, ductile enough, good enough. I unclipped the buckle from my belt. The three engineers watched me the way a surgeon might watch a plumber walk into an operating theater carrying a pipe wrench. I pulled the small flat file from the tool roll I kept in my back pocket, my own file, not thesauri issue, bought second-hand at a market stall on Urine Station for a price I'd already forgotten, and I sat down on the floor, cross-legged, in a wide pool of morning sunlight, and started filing. It took about 4 minutes. I worked a strip off the buckle's lower edge, a little wider than my smallest finger, a little thinner than a playing card. Brass curled away in bright ribbons. The filing sounded loud in that quiet bay, a rhythmic rasp that had no thesauri regulation number. When the strip was free, I held it between my thumb and forefinger and pressed gently, feeling the flex, feeling the give, letting the nerve endings in my fingertips do what no thesauri instrument had a readout for. It felt right. I stood, walked to the press, crouched again, and slid the shim into the gap between the guide rail and the bearing surface. It seated with a faint click, metal finding metal, snug, flush. Try it, I said. The senior engineer looked at the other two. They looked at the diagnostic board. They looked back at me. Then the senior engineer entered the activation sequence. The press cycled, a single test stroke. Smooth and heavy, the whole 3-story frame moving with the controlled violence of a machine that knew exactly what it was for. The hull panel it stamped came out flat, true, and within tolerance. The diagnostic board refreshed. All 900 bars held green. I clipped my belt buckle back on, one edge shorter now. A small bright notch where the brass had been picked up my tool roll, and nodded to nobody in particular. The shim, the senior engineer said. I stopped. From what alloy index entry was it derived? It's not in your index, I said. It's from my belt. The silence again. The sunlit hall, the 3 identical gray figures standing motionless, the press tall and operational behind them, and me, a man with a notched belt buckle and half a sandwich waiting in Bay 2. The material must be catalogued, the senior engineer said, very carefully. All materials in contact with fabrication-grade equipment must hold a valid index entry. Sure, I said, file it however you like. I went back to my crate and finished the sandwich. 3 days later, the assistant fabrication clerk, a younger thesauri, not quite as rigid as the engineers, though not quite as rigid, for a thesauri still meant straighter than a hull beam, found me in the machine bed degreasing bay and handed me a printed slip. The compact's alloy index had been updated. For the first time in 40 years of continuous operation, they had added an entry. Entry 901. I read it standing there in the flat light of the degreasing bay, solvent rag in one hand, the slip in the other, and I read it slowly, because the words deserved to be spoken aloud in a place where 900 entries had been enough for 4 decades. Alloy 901, brass, copper zinc 70/30, provenance, Human belt fastener personal item HALVDENJ badge 7140. Tolerance, unquantified manual assessment non-instrumental. Application, shim gap compensation guide rail wear correction. Note, this entry has no CATALOGUED service life. Decommission schedule pending. Pending, I said. The assistant clerk stood there, both hands clasped behind his back, waiting for a response that his training had no protocol for. I folded the slip and tucked it into my shirt pocket, next to the cloth my sandwich had been wrapped in. Somewhere above us, 4 floors up, the press in Bay 4 was running its 9th consecutive shift on a scrap of my belt buckle and a judgment call from my fingertips. The decommission schedule is still pending. As far as I know, so is the shim.